Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Vino and Veritas Society, welcome to another Vino and Veritas podcast, another episode of Plato's Cave. As you can see, things are a little bit different today. Not only am I still not back in Colorado, I'm actually in Cincinnati, Ohio, visiting a very close friend following our event in Franklin, Tennessee, but also I'm by myself today. Dr. Krannawetter put on a bit of a marathon session on stage in Franklin, Tennessee last week, exactly 1 week from today. He's a little under the weather, and I'm going to take this one on by myself. I hope that doesn't mean you're going to shut down the podcast and go do your own thing. I hope at this point I've earned a little bit of your trust to offer something fun and interesting to talk about. I'm going to go through a lot. I'm going to do a little recap of the event, talk a little bit about the case study, and then get into some of the things happening in the news today that I think are interesting and worthwhile. So I hope you'll give me a shot at this. And again, I'd love your feedback. You know, we always ask for you guys, you're our members. This is important to us that you're enjoying this. And if you have feedback, if you have ways that we can improve this, tell me what you think. How can I do this better? And if you're going to be too harsh, maybe just send it to me as a note. I can always handle that constructive criticism on my own, but doesn't necessarily have to be made public. Just shoot me a little message in our system, or if you have the app, even better, jump in the app and send it that way. I do want to start with the event that Dr. Krannawetter and I put on in Franklin, Tennessee, just last week, called Rediscovering America. Franklin is a town named after Benjamin Franklin. It's about 20 miles to the south of Nashville, maybe 25. Very interesting town. There's a bit of a Mayberry feel to it, but still a bit of a suburban aspect too, and some big city feel. Nashville and Broadway, rather, right down the street. So kind of a cool area. And we were in this unbelievable venue called The Factory. It's an old stove factory. We've talked about this a little bit on some of the podcasts. This is a venue that hosted Donald Trump on his campaign tour in 2015 or 2016, that's hosted numerous different acts and different stage shows over the course of the years, and is also the home for country music fans and classic rock fans. The show CMT Crossroads is actually filmed there, and it's one of my favorites. I always think that's fascinating. So pretty cool thing, and it was really a lot of fun getting a chance to be on stage there. I do have a couple of thank yous that I want to send out in regard to the event. First of all, to those members who made the trip, who came down and visited us in Franklin and came for the show. I hope it was worth your time. I hope it was worth the trip. We certainly loved having you there, and I hope you enjoyed it just as much as we did. Also, specifically, there was a group of you who came and helped me the day before the show. This was a big stage. This was a 40-foot wide stage, 22 feet deep. It was not the kind of thing that we were going to just put Tom's 4x8 chalkboard up on and let him go at it. This was a bigger stage, and it was a bigger moment. And so we decided it required a bigger chalkboard just to really get Tom the assets he needed to have a great show. And a handful of you stepped up and helped me build what really turned it out to be maybe the ninth wonder of the world, a 24-foot wide, 6.5-foot tall chalkboard that covered the majority of the stage. It ended up looking absolutely fantastic. We bought a bunch of lumber at Home Depot, bought some chalkboard panels, and built something in really just an hour or two. It was really quite a feat. And I really do appreciate all of you who came down, who all came to help. And help me put that together, and also help with the rest of the show. You know, Vino and Veritas Society, just being Tom and I, and some volunteers at this point, you guys stepped up, you guys helped us, and we could not have put on this show without you guys, and I really do appreciate it. I know I can speak for Dr. Krannawetter that he does as well. The other person I really want to thank is Mary Zenzen. For those who don't know Mary is the organizer of our Fort Collins chapter, or one of our Fort Collins chapters. And it was really, really important to Mary and to us that we catch this show on video. And we were at a point where we were debating whether or not it was worth it. And Mary said, no, it's really critical You guys need this on video, and it needs to be seen by other people. It needed to be live streamed, and then it needed to be seen by others involved. And so because of that, Mary stepped up as a sponsor, and Mary helped sponsor the live stream. And now we'll be helping to organize on behalf of the Vino Veritas Society some really cool showings of this and some events around the video that we produced of the event. So if anybody's looking to bring a group together, they want to see the presentation, we have really high quality video, really high quality sound, and Tom really did a marathon session. Plus, you get to see Dr. Ben Carson. And for those who weren't aware, who haven't been paying attention to this show, Dr. Ben Carson actually came out and participated in this event with us. We did this in partnership with the American Cornerstone Institute, and Dr. Carson came out and he also put on a great show following Tom. Now, a little inside baseball, a little bit of behind the scenes, something that our members should hear about. The show was actually a little bit reversed over the course of the night. Dr. Carson was about 5 hours late. His plane took off about 5 hours late. Now, he was supposed to go on before Dr. Krannawetter. The idea was a little introduction by me. Dr. Carson was going to come on stage, and then Tom was going to follow up after him. Unfortunately, his flight was delayed, and it was a torrential downpour in Nashville and Franklin. So once he landed, even when he landed, which was after the show had already started, we weren't quite sure what time he was actually going to get there. And that being the case, we kind of were left in the lurch, and Tom put on a great show to make sure that he had plenty of time for Dr. Carson to get there, to get settled, to find his seat, and even hear some of Dr. Kranawetter's presentation, which during conversations afterward, he certainly enjoyed. So to everybody who helped, to Mary Zenzen for helping to make sure there's a great recording of this, thank you. For those of you who want to put on events to host your friends, your family, anybody else, church groups, youth groups, anything else that want to see this Declaration of Independence presentation from Dr. Krannawetter at a really high level, as well as this presentation from Dr. Carson, please either message me in the app on the website, message Mary Zenzen. Any of those two things are great options, and she can help put together something. We are going to be charging for some of these showings, but you guys can work that out with Mary. She's going to be handling that little piece of business for the Vino Veritas Society, which we're also very thankful for. I also want to quickly mention, as another little piece of housekeeping, we do have a new case study up. That case study is a really interesting, thought-provoking essay from Dr. Harry Jaffa. For those who don't remember, Harry Jaffa was Dr. Kranawetter's mentor, teacher, main primary professor. He was on Tom's dissertation committee, and was really one of the most influential minds for Claremont McKenna College, for the Claremont Institute, and even today for Hillsdale. Quite a bit of those ideas and the things that are taught are foundational in Harry Jaffa's work. So this is a short little essay, but short doesn't mean it's not going to take a little while to read. I encourage you to give yourself some time. One of the things that we've learned with Dr. Jaffa, every word is written with incredible intention. And as he writes with intention, he becomes very thoughtful, but you don't want to skip over words. You don't want to read quickly. I find myself, when I read his writing, reading pages over and over again, and I catch something new every time I read it. Words are used at a premium, and he is very thoughtful in his writing. So I hope you enjoy this. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation if you guys use this in your chapter meeting. So with that, I am going to save the case study conversation for a time with Dr. Krannawetter, and I think it's just better if he and I get to discuss this one together, especially because of his relationship with Dr. Jaffa. I want to instead talk a little bit about, and I hope you guys don't mind today, I decided to give myself some notes. It's one thing for Tom and I to banter and talk back and forth, but I wanted to make sure I cover everything and I cover everything properly. I also have some quotes written down and some things that I want to discuss today. So you'll see me reaching forward a little bit. I have a little notepad in front of me with some ideas that I want to discuss. And I want to start today with Taiwan, it seems to be the biggest thing happening in the news right now. There's a lot to say about what to think about Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. And I guess we should start with some background on the country and our situation. And it's not exactly the same because there are some questions about whether or not Taiwan itself is actually a free, independent country of China. There are members of Taiwan's local government that would argue it is. Those same members have argued that the United States have made a promise to them that they would be there to defend, that we would be there rather to defend Taiwan should there be aggression from China or any other country to try to violate their sovereignty. But there are some questions. There are some arguments that some people, including the Chinese Communist Party, are making to say it's actually not an independent sovereign nation. However, beyond that, there really are some interesting dynamics. There's some interesting connections between what's happening in Taiwan and what happened in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we did have a sovereign nation invaded by Russia. We ended up having some significant issues and questions about whether or not we should be getting involved in the situation. In a similar way, there was an unwritten agreement between the governments of both locations. I don't want to call them both nations because I think Taiwan is an independent nation. I would argue that it is, but there are some debates there. But between both places, localities, there were unwritten agreements that the United States would be there to defend their country should they get aggression from other places. And it comes down to one of those things that we probably put ourselves in a situation that we shouldn't have. And for those who didn't watch the podcast we did, must have been a few months ago now, on the conflict in Ukraine. We also did that case study, for those who remember, from Angelo Codevilla that talked about how the Russia-Ukraine situation and how that would be approached, how that would be handled. There are some interesting similarities. There are some interesting problems there that I think are worth exploring in terms of how we are actually, what our commitment is to those two countries. Now that said, the sovereignty of both countries and the loss thereof poses a fairly serious national security risk to the United States, primarily because we have overregulated. There's so much red tape in the United States, as we've talked about since day one of the Vino Veritas Society. There's so much red tape, there's so much overregulation that we potentially lose access to things that are really, really critical to our infrastructure. You know, we talked about in Ukraine, the grain that comes from Ukraine and the amount of food that we rely on Ukraine to provide to the United States. Quite a bit of the regulation is from the Green New Deal and the new green and the new green energy policies and everything else. The regulations that have been around that have made it very difficult on farmers. And this goes all the way back to some of the things we've talked about under FDR. At the same time, in Taiwan, we're dealing with some of the same things when it comes to electronics. Remember, we talked about Afghanistan. Now, it was about a year ago that we left Afghanistan. It was about a year ago that Biden pulled all American presence out of Afghanistan. And at that moment, we lost access to really the largest lithium reserves in the world. Losing that access and putting it in the hands of really what appears to be the Chinese Communist Party has given them a huge advantage. Now, there are some questions about the future of the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is in trouble. There is no question about that. So will they ever be able to put use to the lithium that they've now gotten access to? Who knows? But there are going to be issues with us getting access to lithium going forward for lithium ion batteries, which are the core of every car battery, every phone battery, everything we use. Almost all batteries in the United States at this point are lithium ion to that extent. Also now in Taiwan, Taiwan supplies the world about 70% of its microchips, from what you see in your phones to what you see in your cars to what you see all over the place. And should China decide to invade Taiwan, should China decide to take control of that land, that nation, so to speak, there are questions about our access to microchips with Chinese control and really a Chinese monopoly on microchips. There is a member of our community of the Vino Veritas Society that is heavily involved in that. He could speak a lot better to this than I can, but I do think it's worth being aware of the actual threat that Chinese controlling the flow of microchips to the United States can pose to the things we use on our day-to-day lives, and the things that the cost it will pose to, that will be passed on to consumers. I think the other thing to be aware of is that the talking point from the left on this is generally to say, hey, look, we'll just go build our own microchip facilities. I was watching one of the news programs, the business news programs this morning, actually, and they were talking to some of the owners of the microchip companies. They're talking about it takes as much as 5 or 6 years to build a new factory for microchips simply because of the red tape. Now, that might be a bit of an exaggeration. It might not take quite that long, but you can safely assume it will be several years to get new microchip plants open in the United States, solely because of the red tape of getting different water rights approved and building permits and everything else, and in especially under an administration that is so against building more infrastructure that has potential of harming the environment. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see how that plays out. With all of that said, this whole thing became news really for two reasons. One, we know China's been watching how was the United States reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and did we step up enough? Did we give them the ability to defend themselves, or did we make sure that they were defended? And quite frankly, they looked at that and probably said, we can go invade Taiwan, and they're not going to do the United States is not going to do anything in that sense either. If that's the case, they were just looking for an excuse, and they've been doing military exercise. They've been testing missiles. They've been testing defense systems. And then we had this visit from Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan this week. And she did go. There was a question about whether or not she would go. She had it planned. The Chinese Communist Party said, don't think about it. Don't consider it. It is not appropriate. We've talked about the one China policy. We've heard that term repeatedly throughout this process, and that if Nancy Pelosi went and visited, it would be recognizing a government that the Chinese Communist Party does not recognize as a sovereign authority. There's a couple of things there to really explore. And one of them is it even the purpose? Is it proper purpose of government? Is it Nancy Pelosi's place to go and visit a foreign country? And this is really where I get uncomfortable with the whole conversation, right? It's one thing to say a group of congressmen, a group of senators are going to visit a foreign country for learning purposes. It's another thing altogether when it appears that a member of Congress is going over to act in a diplomatic fashion. And remember, as we've talked about, the proper roles of the different branches of government as outlined in the Constitution, it is the president's job to be the foreign diplomat, to lead foreign diplomacy. And if Nancy Pelosi is going over to do it in place of Joe Biden, we have to question why and what that means. Now, the obvious response from anybody on the left is going to say, but Newt Gingrich did it 25 years ago. That was the last time that a Speaker of the House went, third in line to the president. The Speaker of the House went to a foreign country and went to Taiwan to visit. That was 25 years ago. I would argue the same thing. It was inappropriate then, and it was inappropriate now. And this is where it gets to, we talk quite a bit, and I want to remind everybody, it really gets to the point of committed to your principles, not to people. I think Newt Gingrich was brilliant. I think Newt Gingrich was essential to the party, to the Republican Party. I think Newt Gingrich did amazing things while he was in office. I think Newt Gingrich was a really important figure in Republican political history. Just because I think that about him doesn't mean that I think he should have gone to Taiwan or anywhere else representing the United States in a diplomatic fashion. And so it's just one of those opportunities where I want everybody to make sure you're staying committed to principle over people. And we get into a lot of those conversations when it comes to somebody like a Donald Trump or anything else, which I guess I said that too quickly, and I should continue that thought a little bit further. This goes back to a conversation that Tom and I had, I believe, 2 weeks ago on the podcast. We have gotten into this situation where you're either all in on somebody, you're all out on somebody. And I just said that. And if somebody heard that and hadn't had any other conversation with me, they're going to sit here and say, oh, you're just some never Trumper, you're just some anti-Trump. And I said repeatedly, I think Donald Trump was a very good president. I think he was significantly better than his predecessors on both sides, but even on the Republican side, I think he's one of the better presidents we've had in the last 100 years. Just because I say that doesn't mean that it's not appropriate to critique him or criticize him in moments where he does something wrong. And so when we say that, that's what I mean by be committed to principle and not to people. I can praise a lot of things that he did, and we could sit here and we could probably do an entire podcast on the great things that Donald Trump did while he was in office or attempted to do. There are things, though, that he talked about doing that I was really in favor of. And quite frankly, he just didn't follow through. And there are plenty of reasons for that. It could have been what happened in Congress. It could have been the multiple impeachments. It could have been bad staff. There are all kinds of reasons. I'm not putting it entirely on him, but we need to be fair and even when we think about it from a principle standpoint. And that's why I mean, same thing with Gingrich. I think Gingrich was a phenomenal Speaker of the House. He was a phenomenal member of Congress. I also think him visiting a foreign country as a dignitary, as somebody who is going to represent us diplomatically, was probably inappropriate. It was not. That is not what we elect members of Congress to go do. So just something to think about. The other thing is another recent news piece, and this just happened on Tuesday night. There was an election in Kansas, and this is another one of those stay true to principle and realize how we go about things. For those who didn't pay attention or who didn't know this, there was a vote in the state of Kansas to remove a line in the state constitution that made abortion a right. Right? In the Kansas Constitution, abortion is defined as a right for the people, and that means if it's a right, that means you can't just go and start making new laws to limit or prohibit abortion following the end of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And instead, they had to first remove that clause from the state constitution, and then they could start passing other laws. There's a lot to be said about this. First of all, for the Republicans in the audience, and I try to keep my personal affiliations and associations a little private, but most of you know I fall in that camp. For the Republicans in the audience, let's not make the same mistake that the Democrats made for 49 years. The left for 49 years thought, well, Roe v. Wade, we won the Roe v. Wade decision, and therefore we don't have to do anything about it. It's set. I think what we're going to see is, and what we need to remember is, things can change at any time, and you could see a change in the Supreme Court 50 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 100 years from now, but you could see a change in the Supreme Court. And when that change happens, you do stand the risk. You do run the risk of losing out on that Supreme Court decision. If that Supreme Court decision goes the other way, then all of a sudden you're going to be dealing with the same thing the left is today. They had 49 years to make law out of Roe. They failed to do so. This is not over. This is not a battle that's over. This is not a battle that you should just move on from and say, okay, we got Roe overturned. We won. Let's move on. And I think what we saw in Kansas is a perfect example of that. I think the other warning that everybody needs to be aware of, and the importance of the conversations to go out and be had. In Kansas, there was a 300% voter increase, turnout increase, basically attributable to this one bill. So you saw 300% increase. I believe it went from about 89,000 to 279,000 people turning out for a midterm primary season vote on a constitutional amendment, on a state constitutional amendment. So when you see something like that, you have to understand, and we need to be aware that this is going to affect both the midterms and the 24 election, and this is going to drive voter turnout. So I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of what happened there, that is going on. And like I said, this is not something as simple as, okay, Roe v. Wade was overturned, so now there's no chance of it ever going back in the other direction. The left made that mistake for 49 years while Roe was on the books, and it's important not to stop now. The next thing, and sort of the last big topic I wanted to talk about, we have seen a massive change in the media over the last, I don't know, month, 2 months, 3 months, that I think is an important thing for us to be aware of. And it actually shows some hope, some positivity. And I thought let's end this podcast on a more of a positive note. Last week, many of you know that it was the 25th anniversary of the Harry Potter series, the premiere of the Harry Potter series. And Harry Potter has not been without its threats from cancel culture over the last year or two. And even more recently, J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter, made some comments about trans people, things like that got her hit by cancel culture. Cancel culture came for her and said, you can't say that, and we're not going to participate. It even got to the point where there was a rumor, and she hasn't denied it, that Emma Watson, who played Hermione in the series, that Emma Watson was going to refuse to participate in any future Harry Potter activity if J.K. Rowling was still involved. It's one of those things where we're still facing some of these things. Now, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of wins when it comes to media. And we're seeing changes everywhere. Let's start with Netflix. And this is why I said earlier, I have some quotes. I put some notes down. I want to read some of the things that have come out of Netflix. First of all, there was an internal memo that went out, I want to say about a month and a half ago, that was part of a conversation. Now, Netflix has notoriously been a very open community. It is not hierarchical when I say open community. There is not a managers tell you what to do and you do it and you keep your mouth shut, which is how most businesses have operated for a long time. The reason for that is it was a supply and demand problem. What I think a lot of people don't realize is the huge demand there has been over the last 2 decades for really high level developers, both in and out of Silicon Valley, computer programmers, web developers, software developers who can do things at a level. And there has been a lot of stealing of staff between companies like Apple and Google and Netflix and Facebook and Twitter and the like, that they are constantly trying to take each other's staff because there has been a massive shortage of talented developers out there. Netflix started as a technology first company. When Netflix first started, there was not a lot of competition from other platforms. There was no Apple Plus, there was no Paramount Plus, there was no Disney Plus, there was no ESPN Plus. It's all these plus streaming services, right? You didn't even really have Amazon Prime streaming at the beginning. So when Netflix first started, they didn't have a lot of competition. That meant their primary challenge was getting content out that played quickly, that played at a high level. For those who were Game of Thrones fans, Game of Thrones, when it was going through its final couple of seasons, they started having major problems with people who were trying to stream the show on HBO Go rather than them watching it on cable. The streams were shutting down. There was too much traffic, and Netflix really, they put a high priority on web developers. As a result of that, those web developers really got a say in everything. And as we know, the Silicon Valley development community, it is really very, very, very progressive. They lean very far left, and many of them, it's fights that I've had with friends for years. And I was heavily involved in that space in Boulder, Colorado for a while. And dealt with a lot of very frustrating conversations, including several developers telling me anybody who makes over $400,000 a year should be taxed at 90+%. I tried to remind them those were the same people who were funding the companies they were working for. They didn't want to hear it. There was no logic there. We know how that conversation usually goes, but they did that because they knew their talents were at a premium. We've seen a real change, though, in Silicon Valley over the last few years, and for Netflix in particular, where the technology required is much lighter. It requires much less from a technology standpoint. We have great cloud computing and cloud servers to be able to do things like that and to be able to stream. Now we have a challenge with content where they're being challenged by a number of streaming services: Amazon Prime, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, Apple Plus, and everything else. And so you do now have Netflix coming in saying, okay, this is now a content challenge. The developers have a little less weight to throw around, I guess is the best way to put it, right? You have less opportunity as a developer. You're not needed as much. They're not as desperate for you to be a happy employee, and they can afford to lose the developers here and there in order to make sure that the company stays successful. So going back to the release that Netflix put out a few weeks ago, they basically said not everyone in the company is going to like or agree with everything on our service. I'm just going to go ahead and read this. It says, while every title is different, we approach them based on the same set of principles. We support the artistic expression of the creators we choose to work with. We program for a diversity of audiences and tastes, and we let viewers decide what's appropriate for them versus having Netflix censor specific artists or voices. I mean, this is freedom, right? This is exactly what we try to talk about. And I want to call out an important word. They use diversity, which I'm sure their teams, their developers really love that they mentioned diversity. Diversity of thought, diversity of ideas is actually really critical. It's an important part of freedom. And I want everybody to make sure they're separating the diversity, inclusion, and equity side of things that we hear about all the time, these diversity programs that are about gender and race and everything else, trans, whatever else you want to talk about. This is a diversity of thought, diversity of appetite, diversity of interest, which those things really are important to a successful business like Netflix. They continue. As employees, we support the principle that Netflix offers a diversity of stories, using that word again, even if we find some titles counter to our own personal values. So this is saying, this is senior management. Reed Hastings, I'm get the two mixed up, is actually sitting here saying, look, I might not even like what we're doing, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, because we do have to run a business. And this is when the markets start to take over and show how important success is for the company. He goes on to say, depending on your role, you may need to work on titles you perceive to be harmful. If you'd find it hard to support our content breadth, Netflix may not be the best place for you. And I just love that he was willing to stand up and say, look, if you don't like what we're doing here, and if you find yourself that you can't work on something simply because you disagree with it, this might not be the right place for you to work. And that's what a freedom-based company is really all about. So I give a lot of credit to Netflix, and we're seeing this in some other places. And I thought I'd throw out a few examples. One, Paramount Plus came out publicly and said they're not going to allow cancel culture to cancel old TV shows that they've purchased, that they believe have legs, have interest within the community. They're not going to let those stories, those movies, those shows be canceled simply because somebody doesn't agree with them. Now that's what they've said publicly. There have been rumors, there have been conversations that have come out of internal all hands meetings, out of HR, out of some of the other things that actually have said the same thing as Netflix, that they are going to produce and promote content from a variety of perspectives and let the audience choose what they want to watch and what they don't want to watch. Now, it works really well for streaming services because streaming services have unlimited real estate. They can just keep adding more and more and more programming, and it doesn't have to take the place of something else. Cable networks, on the other hand, have limited real estate. If you consider each block of 30 minutes real estate on the network, every time there's an opportunity cost. Every time that they give a show a space, a block, they're giving up on something else, and they have to make sure people are watching it. What we've seen, and this is where I really have a lot of hope lately, what we're seeing is a huge expanse in the cancellation of shows that just are not being successful, that are on cable television. And I thought I'd run through that list. And I'm going to start with the most recent and probably the one, I hate saying this, but probably the one I'm most happy about because it's on TBS and it drove me crazy during March Madness. If you guys remember, March Madness was a big thing for me. We did a couple of podcasts where we talked about it. And during the March Madness event, there were a lot of games on TBS, on TNT, on True TV, and they would advertise the other shows that are on that network. The result was we constantly saw ads for Samantha Bee, Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. It was this huge show that she was just as against Republicans and Trump as she could possibly be, to the point where this was her very last quote. So the show was canceled. I guess I should preface first, the show was recently canceled. She did her last recording from her backyard because she had COVID and she wasn't comfortable, or they weren't comfortable having her come in studio. Whole other conversation. You guys can talk about that on your own. But the very last thing she said was in regard to Roe v. Wade. And she put this out on the evening that Roe was decided or was overturned. The quote was, "We have to raise hell in our cities, in Washington, in every restaurant Justice Alito eats for the rest of his life. Because if Republicans have made our lives hell, it's time to return the favor." That happened to end up being the last thing that Samantha Bee ever said on television. Her show was recently canceled. There will not be another season. And I'm not going to miss her. But it showed that there was no market appetite for that. We're seeing that across the board for these leftist shows. Deuces and Miro was another short-lived show on, might have been TBS as well, that was two young Black men really just trying to be funny about politics and really not knowing what they were talking about. And at one point it just got stale and even the left stopped listening to it. We've seen that Conan, the late night shows, Conan has ended. James Corden has announced that he's ending his show in 2023. They're just running out of things to talk about. And it was like, without Trump, we might as well just stop. There was a show on NBC called A Little Late with Lily Singh. That was canceled. There was a show, we all know Jon Stewart from The Daily Show. Jon Stewart started a new show called The Problem with Jon Stewart on Apple TV. Never gained any traction. They ended up no longer producing new episodes. CNN Plus died within weeks of its launch. They put a fortune into it. It never made it. And what was interesting was Samantha Bee's producer actually came out and said, look, there's called it a late night recession. He just said people are just done watching TV at night. There's no more interest in these late night shows. The reality is that's a lie. And the reason we know that is there has been one show that has been consistently successful for the last 2 years, and that's Gutfeld on Fox News. Gutfeld continuously gets 2 million viewers a night. It outdoes every single other late night show on television. Sometimes it outdoes all of them combined. And Gutfeld has been a hugely successful show on Fox News as a late night segment for really a younger audience. It is not geared towards, it's geared towards the same audience that the other late night shows are geared to, sort of that 25 to 50 age demographic. And he's doing 2 million viewers in that age demographic on an average night. So we are seeing this huge change and people wanting to move in that direction. Anybody who's making an excuse that says otherwise, that says, oh, it's just a change in people's appetites, people aren't interested in late night television anymore, it's just simply not true. For those who haven't seen Gutfeld before, I'd encourage you to watch. I think it's very interesting. I don't know if he'd want me to share this, but Dr. Crenno was actually a professor of Kat Timpf in her college years. He spent some time. He got to know her as a student, and she's been interesting to me. I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about her, but I've watched her grow and evolve on television. I think it's been very interesting to see where she is now with Gutfeld, and he always has on great guests, and it's a great conversation. I have a little tie to Gutfeld in that we worked for Brothers at the same time. For a lot of people don't realize, Greg Gutfeld comes from the magazine world like I do. And when I was working for my magazine brands, Greg Gutfeld was the editor-in-chief of Men's Health magazine. And we've seen the direction and sort of the tail off, the fall off that has happened as a result of Gutfeld leaving Men's Health and moving to Fox News, where really everything he touches seems to grow. Anyway, his publisher at the time, last name was Zizenko. Zizenko's brother, another Zizenko, was our senior publisher at our magazine and eventually CEO. So I kind of share that, and I've enjoyed watching Gutfeld, and I can see some of the same lessons that we both learned from the Zizenko brothers over time. So that's sort of where we're at. Some different things happening in the news, and some things that I hope everybody's paying attention to. Like I said, really think about that principle over person when it comes to Taiwan, and really think about what that Kansas law means. And then I hope the ideas of what's going on in the media and what we're seeing, especially on television, the cancellations, gives you a little bit of hope that the market doesn't necessarily want what the left is selling it. We just have to come in with a good message. And that message is the idea of the founders. That message is the idea that the founders presented to us of freedom and independence. And I think we're seeing on a large scale that people really do want that. So continue to guard the idea of the American founding, continue to guard the ideas of the Vino Veritas Society, the ideas of America, and let's keep being the guardians that we committed to be. Until next time, hopefully Tom will be able to join me. Nos sumus custodes. See you soon.